Following. One closer to bottom too. There it is. Took that little bit of snap. There's a few fish cruising down there. But this guy took that little bit of snap to get triggered, which is sometimes what it takes. Oh, well, there we go. First walleye of the day. Well, welcome back. We are sitting in the beginning of August here, so I want to talk through some of my top August walleye patterns. So we're going to dive right in with this first one that I just caught that fish, and that is these kind of mid-range flat. But I really see these fish out cruising these in August a lot of times. One, because they're just getting pushed out a little bit deeper with that water temp, and another thing is, as you can see here, I'm not even having to pan around. You can just see a bunch of bait. There's actually another fish kind of mixed in there as well. So a lot of those pieces kind of bring these fish out to the area, especially throughout the summer. You have these bug hatches, and these bug hatches are starting to come off bottom, especially in the muddy areas. That brings in the bait, whether it's perch or whatever it might be, and then those walleyes are not usually too far behind. And a couple things that I'm looking for when I'm looking for these kind of mid-range flats, like I said, they're like that 15 to 30 foot range or so, and if they are adjacent to some sort of structure, whether it's humps or even a shoreline break, that is usually helpful. It gives something for them to relate to. They'll kind of move on and off that structure and back out to these flats. And the other thing that I key on is I don't want them necessarily too big or too small. You know, a lot of times I'm looking for maybe a football field size or so, obviously give or take a little bit. When I do see these fish, they will sometimes be in groups, especially if they're a little bit smaller fish, but a lot of times I'll see them in one, maybe in smaller groups. And some of my favorite presentations that I like, the one that I just caught that one on, is just a classic Smeltinator jig and that eye candy minnow. That thing is just a do-all bait in the summertime, you know, especially if you're not wanting to buy live bait. If you watch my jig fishing video that I just put out, I'll put that link in the link below as well, but I talk all about the different ways that you can work this bait. It's so versatile, but this is probably one of my favorites because you can do it in so many different ways. If I see maybe there's groups of fish, or if they're a little more stationary, I will pull out a slip bobber and I'll slip bobber these fish, especially if it's not too deep, so I can move quickly. But I will also use reaction baits. I really like using reaction baits on this style because I can move quickly. I can go from one fish to the next fish to the next, especially if some of these flats have quite a few fish. You know, if you don't have forward-facing sonar, an awesome thing to do is drive around. If you mark a few fish on some of these areas with your 2D or side jig, then you can pull bottom bouncers and spinners over tops of these. It can work fairly quickly, and like I said, that little blade helps you trigger some of these bites, and just a very easy way to cover ground and catch some of these fish. So that is pattern number one. We're gonna drive around, keep fishing. I'm gonna talk through a few other patterns that I typically see walleyes doing in August. Ooh. Yep, that guy came up and crushed it. I kind of have a feeling this is gonna be a pike. If it is a walleye, that was an awesome bite. That thing just came up and smoked it. You can see it kind of suspended over that open water. Let's see what we got. We got a walleye. That was an awesome bite. Decent fish too. Oh man, is it fun when they do that. He saw that thing dropping down and he just came up and smoked it. Sweet fish, probably 23 or so inches, but that thing was just fired up. I might change out my mic here. I don't know how this one's gonna sound. The wind's picking up just a little bit, so I'm gonna swap out my mic and then we'll talk suspended walleyes. All right, we are back in action. Suspended fish are a pattern, but they can be in a lot of different locations. You know, when I'm looking at suspended fish, usually they're anywhere off bottom, 5, 10, 20, 30 feet, depending on how deep you're fishing. But a few areas that I saw those is one, over kind of some of those same mid-range flats, or even some of those deeper flats, 30, 40 foot flats. I see them cruising out around there, chasing over that bait. I see them even over some of the basin type stuff, especially if you're on a little bit shallower lake, but even on deeper lakes, I'll see them out over that 90, 100 feet of water, over that open water basin stuff. And I'll also see them suspended off and around any bits of structure, especially if there is quite a few different humps or points in one general area. They'll kind of move around in between some of those and just suspend over that open water. water type stuff. And the reason that these fish are out suspended like this is, one, they're moving out just trying to get to some of that little bit cooler water, but probably more importantly, they're out chasing some of these bait fish. You know, a lot of times you'll see these big pods of bait roaming around. You also see ciscos out, so especially those bigger walleyes are out chasing some of those ciscos. When I'm doing more of this suspended bite, I'm really going to be doing baits that I can cast and I can move very quickly with, because if you've seen these suspended fish, they move a lot. So same thing that I just caught that one on, Smeltinator jig, eye candy, minnow, plastic. I will use reaction style baits too. I'll use maybe glide baits or something along those lines, and really try to jig these aggressively, especially those get down so quickly. You want to be able to cast to them, get it down right in front of their face as quickly as you can. That one you saw shot right up as soon as this thing was falling, so it probably would have bit on anything. But if you're finding some of these fish, suspended fish especially, a little more stationary, I will drop a slip bobber on them. Just kind of let it dangle in front of their face. That's again if they're not moving as much. And if you don't have live scope, you don't have forward facing sonar, this is an opportunity to maybe troll lead core, or you can put on some of those heavier bottom bouncers again and troll some of those spinners and move around over that open water stuff. And what you're looking for, especially on your 2D, is you're looking for bait, big bait pods, and obviously some of those suspended marks. You can get that bite dialed in a little bit better where you're seeing a few of these marks, but it just takes a little bit more driving around. Obviously you can just roam over open water, but you're not going to be quite as efficient as if you drive around a little bit and find what depth some of these fish are at. Well, we're going to keep on moving here and show you another August pattern. Ooh, coming up for it. Yeah. Right around it, taking turns. There, he popped it. Taking it down. Reel down, feel weight, set the hook. And we are on to our next spot. Next spot, we're going to be talking here about some mid-lake structure. And we got a walleye. Oh, my net's way over here. Well, I'll net it back here. Oh. And show it off up here. Let me spot lock here. Another sweet walleye. Again, like I said, whoa, yet another pattern. There are so many patterns going on, and I mean, I don't think it's going to be a surprise to anybody that mid-lake structure is an August pattern, because pretty much once it gets to be mid-June, early July, this mid-lake structure just heats up. What I'm typically looking for when I'm looking for mid-lake structure in August, I'm looking for, you know, points, maybe some humps that top out into that kind of 20 to 30 foot range. That tends to be the sweet spot, and that is where the top of it is, depending on, you know, what that lake sets up like. It might be more 15, but that 20 to 30 foot range seems to be a prime time summer mid-lake structure pattern, no matter where you're at. And a lot of times I do like them to be somewhere adjacent to some deeper water. If I can find mid-lake structure, whether it's sandy or weedy humps even, but a lot of times it's going to be rocky humps. If you can find some of those adjacent to some mid-lake structure, that is very, very often going to hold fish. And the nice thing about this, especially if you have electronics, is you can work through these very quickly. You can go from hump to hump to hump and look over them, see if there's fish. If there's not, you can keep moving. Just a very efficient way to fish a bunch of different areas. And the reason why these walleyes are out around this mid-lake structure is obviously, again, similar to what we talked about before, is they're moving out a little bit deeper to some of that cooler water, but there's just a lot for them to feed on right now. A lot of that bait will kind of hang around there because they have areas to hide, whether it's rocks or even some weeds. But a lot of times what we find too is there's crayfish hanging around these rocks. So these walleyes like to hang out, they will eat those crayfish as well. There's a lot of times some sweet spots that you can find, whether it's saddles or maybe points sticking off it, or maybe like a feeding shelf where it's shallower on one side, deeper on the other, but there's a little bit of a shelf. All those kinds of things will hold fish. And this is another thing that you can do easily without live scope. You can drive over with your 2D. That's a classic pattern that's been going on for a long time. That is a pattern that I've fished my whole life. Drive over these with 2D. You can drop something right on, whether it's a slip bobber or a reaction style bait. When I'm fishing mid-lake structure, I do tend to fish a little bit differently, because one of the things that you'll notice is I see a lot more like eater size fish, and I see a lot more fish in groups when I'm fishing some of these humps especially. They'll be eater-sized fish potted up, and they're not moving a whole lot. Usually when they're relating to structure, they're not moving around quite as much as they do maybe over some of those flats or some of that open water stuff. And so I'm gonna fish a little bit differently. I can fish a little more station and a little more finesse. So a few of the things that I'll do is what you just saw there. That was a slip bobber. So this is my slip bobber on my, this is the Sharpshooter by Tubi. Got a 3000 size reel to spool up that line a little bit. Norfin light bite bobber with my weight. I have a little heavier weight because when I'm fishing this deeper water, I want to get down quickly. And this is just a, you see a little remnant of my crawler, a little 16th ounce long shank jig from Norfin. That's a tungsten one. Having tungsten is super helpful. The other things that I will work a drop shot on those. Drop shots are awesome because you can keep that bait in that strike zone the whole time. You know when you're on bottom. If you're using tungsten weights, that makes a little bit of noise, can sometimes trigger some of those fish to come to the area. But probably one of my favorite ways to target fish on the mid-lake structure, especially when I'm looking for bigger fish, is using some sort of glide bait. And I really like that because you can work very quickly, but it also triggers some of those bigger bites. So if you're seeing maybe one, maybe two fish up off bottom and a little bit more away from some of the groups, that's a great time to use that glide bait, where if they're kind of potted up in a group and you can tell they're a little more eater size class, that's when I will use a slip bobber or a drop shot or some of those presentations. And again, if you don't have live scope, another easy pattern to do, drive around with your 2D. When you see these fish, you can either drive over them, cast back on them, or have your bait ready, or you drive over it, drop it straight on their heads and either start ripping it around or drop that slip bobber on them and just let it sit in front of their face. So we're gonna keep fishing, and then we're gonna talk about probably one of the most consistent patterns that you see on a lot of lakes in the August time frame. Yep, just snapping it right above those weeds right there. Oh, I'm hoping this isn't a pike. Nope, it's a good walleye. Snapping it right above those weeds. You can see all that bait. Oh boy. See all that bait hanging around the tops of those weeds. Another decent fish. Oh man, hello. He's not done. Yeah, you can just see all that bait hanging right around there. Whoa, there we go. Whew, finally got him in. Another solid fish too. You can see that one doing the damage yet again. Smeltinator jig and that eye candy plastic. That has just been a deadly combo lately. Come on, there we go. Show it off here. Another solid fish. Yeah, these walleyes, when they're chasing these artificials, can be some of the bigger fish. So, like I said, the next one we're going to talk about is fishing weeds, and that can come in a lot of different, shapes and varieties when it gets to be this August time frame. You can see these ones right here. Big time those low-lying weeds. Kind of like that sandgrass, almost like that char, and you can just see bait everywhere. I'll pan around just so you can see that a little bit more. There's areas where it gets a little more barren, and there's areas where you can see almost that wall of weeds right there. So this is that thicker stuff. I'll drop the camera down here and just kind of show you what it looks like. It's a little bit more of that kind of sandgrass, chargrass, depending on the lake that you're fishing. One of my favorite patterns is fishing the good, tall, green cabbage. And one of the things you'll see these fish just milling around in there. Sometimes they'll pull off the edge a little bit, but you'll see schools of fish either on the edges or outwork in the tops of the weeds, or you will see fish kind of, especially those bigger ones, milling around right inside, and you can really pick that apart very easily. And there's obvious reasons why these walleyes hang around weeds. There's shade for them, especially when it's hot and sunny and calm like it is today. There's shade for them. There is usually bait present. As you can see down here, this one is not as much the shade, but a lot more of the bait kind of cruising around. So they have bait, they have stuff to eat. A lot of times there's good oxygen because there's those weeds up in there. So weeds, pretty much throughout the whole year, once they grow up and get green, they are going to be holding some fish. And one of my favorite things is looking for either open patches in the weeds or looking for more of those sparse weeds where you can kind of identify some of those fish in them. And some of my favorite ways to fish the weeds are, one, with slip bobbers. Slip bobbers are awesome because you can put them at the desired height. You can hang it above the weeds. You can just let it sit in front of their face. And especially if there's groups of fish or,
pods of eater size fish. Another thing that I will do is work a drop shot through the weeds. That is a very effective weed technique because you can work it through there very easily. You can always have that bait in the strike zone. You won't get hung up on weeds too badly. If you do, it's just on that weight, so it's not a big deal. It's not messing with your bait. Another one you just saw here was jig and plastic. I like jig and plastic because you don't have to worry about like the perch, bluegills, that kind of stuff pecking off your crawler, your live bait. You can work it through there. And another technique that you can do is you can really rip jig through there. So you can use a big jig head, a big paddle tail, and you can just rip it through those weeds. Sometimes that can trigger some of those really big walleyes cruising around in those weeds. And if you don't have forward-facing sonar, you're not really worried about picking it apart. One of the most effective techniques once it gets to be this late summertime, specifically August, is pulling spinners over tops or on the edges of the weeds. And you can cover big areas. So this is more you're looking for areas where you are finding these big weedy flats. You can pull spinners over top of those and really trigger some of those fish to bite. And great way to cover ground, great way to get bites, and you'll likely catch other species mixed in as well, so that's always a bonus. But as far as looking at a map goes, this can look a lot of different ways. Some of these, it's just a gradual break as it goes out, and there's just different types of weeds as you get deeper and deeper. Once you get to the deeper edge, you get that really good sparse weeds. Some areas there's a big weedy flat, and it's going to be a lot of weeds over a lot of it, and you try to find some of those open areas or maybe that first break line. These are actually some deeper structure, and they are some deeper lying weeds in that kind of 15 to 25 foot range. Not as much that big green stuff, but just a lot of different styles of weeds that you can find. Another thing I did want to say is obviously August, it can be kind of a grind at times, so being able to have a lot of these different areas to try can be super beneficial. I'm not gonna lie, I was out here for I think three and a half hours, and we caught maybe a handful of fish, had a few other bites. It wasn't like we were just crushing fish like crazy, but worked through them, tried a lot of different areas, and we're eventually able to put some pieces together.